somewhere beneath you, beneath the soil, beneath the bedrock, beneath the deep cold layers of the earth. The ocean is moving. It has always been moving. Long before your name existed, long before the city you live in had a single stone laid upon another, the sea was breathing in and out against coastlines that no human eye had ever seen. It was vast then. It is vast now. And in the ancient world, in the candle-lit minds of people who looked out at the horizon and understood, instinctively and completely, that something enormous lived beyond it. That vastness had a name, Poseidon. Even the word moves like water. It doesn't crack or snap. It rolls. Poseidon. The Greeks who first whispered it were not speaking of a myth. They were not reaching for metaphor or convenience. They were naming something they believed to the marrow of their bones. A living, breathing, furious, magnificent presence that held the entire ocean in the palm of one hand and the earth itself in the other. He was the second most powerful being in all of existence, by their reckoning, second only to Zeus, and depending on whom you asked, on which coast you stood, on which night the sea had taken someone you loved, he was more feared than his brother entirely. This is the story of Poseidon, not a quick retelling, not a list of myths and dates. We are going to descend slowly and carefully into the world he ruled. We are going to understand who he was, what he demanded, what he gave, and what he destroyed. We are going to meet the creatures that swam at his command, walk the temples where mortals knelt and trembled, and trace the long, unbroken reach of his influence. From the crashing waves of ancient Greece, all the way to the quiet corners of our modern world, where his shadow still falls without most people ever noticing. But first, let us understand the scale of what we are talking about. In the Greek conception of the cosmos, the world was divided after the fall of the Titans. Three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, drew lots for their kingdoms. Zeus claimed the sky, Hades accepted the underworld, and Poseidon received the sea. What sounds like the middle share was, in reality, something almost incomprehensible in scope. The ancient Greeks believed the ocean encircled the entire known world. It was not simply the Mediterranean they were speaking of. The sea, to them, was the edge of everything. To rule, it was to rule the boundary between the known and the utterly unknowable. And Poseidon's domain did not stop at the waterline. He was the earth shaker. Enosikthon. He held the ground beneath human feet in his fist, and when he struck his great trident against the earth, that three-pronged weapon of absolute authority, mountains trembled, coastlines collapsed, and cities fell silent in an instant. Earthquakes were his breath, tsunamis were his footsteps. The ground you walk on today was once, to the ancient world, a thing that could betray you without warning. And when it did, you knew exactly whose hand was responsible. He was also the tamer of horses. This surprises people. The god of the sea, what business does he have with horses? But in Greek mythology, the horse was his creation. He struck stone with his trident, and the first horse rose from the earth, wild-eyed and trembling. From that moment, every cavalry charge, every chariot race, every midnight ride across a moonlit plain carried his fingerprint. His creatures were as varied as the ocean itself. The hippocampus, half horse, half fish, pulled his golden chariot across the waves. The great sea serpents moved at his word. Dolphins were his heralds, his companions, the joyful messengers he sent ahead when he was in good temper. Whales moved through the dark water below him like slow, living shadows. Even Scylla and Charybdis, those two monstrous terrors that devoured sailors whole, existed within his reach, within his awareness, within what we might cautiously call his design. He was worshipped on nearly every coastline the Greeks ever touched. His temples stood at capes and peninsulas, those thin fingers of land that reach into the sea, as if the earth itself is trying to make peace with the water. At Sauniel, at Corinth, at Paestum in southern Italy, where one of his temples still stands today, golden and worn and absolutely astonishing. He was not a gentle god. The sea is not gentle, but the sea is also breathtaking and generous and alive with a beauty that no one who has ever stood at its edge in the early morning has been able to fully explain. Poseidon was all of that too. And this, in the long and patient hours ahead, is what we are going to explore. Sit back, let the world slow down. The ocean has been here far longer than any of us, and it has a great deal to say. Before there was a god of the sea, there was darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of a room with the curtains drawn, or the soft darkness behind closed eyes on a quiet evening. This was something older and more absolute. The Greeks called it chaos, not disorder as we use the word today, but a vast, yawning void. A great and silent nothing from which everything, eventually, would emerge. And from chaos came Gaia, the earth herself. And from Gaia came the first generation of immortal beings, enormous and elemental, and barely resembling what we would later call gods at all. These were the Titans. And it is here, in that primordial darkness, in the long age before Olympus, before temples, before the first human being ever lifted their head and squinted at the sky. It is here that the story of Poseidon truly begins. His mother was Rhea, graceful, ancient, sorrowful Rhea, a titaness of deep feeling. She was bound in marriage to Cronus, the lord of time himself, the youngest and most cunning of the Titans, who had seized control of the cosmos by doing something so brazen, so cold-blooded, that even by the standards of immortal beings it demands a pause. Cronus had overthrown his own father, Uranos, with an iron sickle and a willingness to do what his brothers could not bring themselves to do. He seized the throne of creation. He made himself king of all things, and then, almost immediately, he received a prophecy that would poison every day of his reign. He would be overthrown, not by a rival, not by a forgotten titan rising from the margins, by his own child. Cronus responded the way that powerful beings throughout all of history have responded to the threat of succession. He tried to prevent it entirely. When Rhea gave birth, Cronus took the infant and swallowed it whole. He did this not once, but 5 times. Hestia, goddess of the hearth. Demeter, goddess of the harvest. Hera, who would become queen of Olympus. And Hades, who would rule the dead. Each one born into the warmth of the world. Each one taken, each one sealed away in the stomach of a god who loved his throne more than his children. And then came Poseidon. Rhea held her newborn son and understood with perfect clarity what was about to happen. Some accounts tell us she wrapped a foal in swaddling cloth and handed it to Cronus, who swallowed the substitution without suspicion. Others say she simply surrendered the child, weeping, with nowhere left to turn. The versions differ, as they so often do across centuries of retelling, but the result was the same. Poseidon, god of the sea, lord of earthquakes, tamer of horses, spent the early years of his existence not in the ocean, not on Olympus, but in the stomach of his father. Imprisoned, patient, waiting in a darkness that even chaos itself might have found uncomfortable. There is something quietly extraordinary about this image, if you sit with it long enough. The most powerful force of nature the ancient world had ever conceived. The god who would one day make the earth tremble with a single strike of his trident, who would summon storms that scattered entire fleets like autumn leaves, began his existence swallowed, contained, utterly powerless. It is a reminder, perhaps, that even the greatest forces in the universe have an origin story that begins with vulnerability. The ocean itself was once ice. Everything vast was once small. He would not stay small for long. when Zeus was born, the sixth child, the one that Rhea finally protected successfully by hiding him on the island of Crete and handing Cronus a stone wrapped in cloth. The countdown began. Zeus grew in secret, raised by nymphs on the island of Crete, nourished by the goat Amalthea, shaped by the wild and windswept mountains of a world that did not yet know what he would become. And when he was ready, he moved. With the help of the Titaness Metis, Zeus prepared a powerful emetic, a mixture that would force Cronus to disgorge everything he had consumed. He disguised himself and approached his father, and Cronus drank. What followed is one of the most viscerally dramatic moments in all of mythology. The children came back, one by one, in reverse order of their swallowing. The gods emerged, fully grown now, returned to their true immortal stature, blinking into a world they had never properly seen. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. Imagine, if you can, that emergence, that first breath of open air after an imprisonment without light, without space, without movement, the first sensation of the world's wind, and with it something building, an anger, a hunger, a sense of destiny deferred that would make Poseidon one of the most volatile and formidable presences in the Greek pantheon for the entirety of his existence. The sea, after all, does not forget. It carries everything that has ever been thrown into it. Poseidon had been thrown into darkness, and he carried that with him always, in the quickness of his temper, in the ferocity of his storms, in the way he pursued grievances across decades and across oceans without ever quite letting them go. But first, there was a war to fight, the Titanomachy. Even the name carries weight. It means, simply, the War of the Titans, but there is nothing simple about what it describes. This was a war of 10 years. A war fought between two generations of immortal beings on a scale so enormous that the ancient poets struggled to find language sufficient to contain it. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era, described it as a conflict that shook the very foundations of the earth and the sea together, that the thunderclaps of Zeus's lightning and the crash of Titan against Olympian could be heard at the edges of the universe. On one side stood Cronus and the Titans, the old order, the established power of an age that believed itself permanent. On the other, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia. 6 gods, newly freed, with everything to prove. They were outnumbered. They were younger. They had no established stronghold, no armies, no accumulated centuries of authority. What they had, in those early desperate years, was each other, and a decision made by Zeus that would prove to be the turning point of the entire conflict. Deep beneath the earth, sealed away in a prison called Tartarus, languished the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones. Monstrous, magnificent beings imprisoned by Cronus, who feared their power as much as his father had. Zeus descended to Tartarus and freed them. In return, these ancient and enormous beings gave gifts. To Zeus, they gave the thunderbolt. To Hades, they gave the helm of darkness, a cap of invisibility that could make the wearer vanish entirely from mortal and immortal sight alike. And to Poseidon, they gave the trident, that 3-pronged spear of incomprehensible power. It is one of the most recognizable symbols in all of human history. Reproduced on coins, on shields, on the walls of temples, on the flags of navies, we have never stopped drawing it. And the reason is not merely aesthetic. The trident, in the hands of Poseidon, was not simply a weapon. It was an instrument of dominion. When he drove it into the earth, the ground split. When he raised it over the sea, the water responded. It was the physical manifestation of his authority, the proof held in his hands that the world answered to him. Armed now, the gods fought. The details of the battles are fragmentary. passed down in pieces by poets who were themselves writing centuries after the stories first took shape. But the broad shape of what the ancients believed is clear enough. The hecatoncheires hurled mountains. Zeus rained lightning without ceasing. The sea boiled and the sky burned. And after 10 years, after a conflict that reshaped the very landscape of a mythological world, the Titans broke. Cronus was defeated. He and his allies were cast into Tartarus, sealed behind walls of bronze, guarded by the 100-handed ones for eternity. The old order was finished. The age of the Olympians had begun. And then came the moment that defined the rest of Poseidon's existence. The lots were drawn. There are different accounts of exactly how this worked, whether it was a formal ceremony, whether it was a game, whether it was simply three brothers standing together in the silence after a war and agreeing, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, to divide what they had won. But the outcome is consistent across almost every version of the myth. Zeus took the sky, Hades took the underworld, and the sea, the boundless, encircling, world-defining sea, became Poseidon's. The earth, the mountains, and Olympus itself were to be held in common between all three brothers. But the deep water, the rolling surface, the dark trenches beneath the waves, the rivers and springs, and the unknown distances beyond every horizon, all of it was his. He descended to the sea floor and built his palace there. Ancient sources describe it as a breathtaking place, shining with gold and silver and the iridescent beauty of sea glass and pearl, draped in the quiet green light that filters through deep water on a calm afternoon. His horses were stabled there, creatures with golden manes and bronze hooves that never rusted, who could skim across the surface of the ocean so smoothly that the waves barely stirred beneath them. Sea creatures gathered around his palace the way birds gather in trees, naturally, instinctively, as though the palace was simply the center of all underwater life, which in every meaningful sense it was. He was home, perhaps for the first time. The god who had been swallowed by his father, sealed in darkness, freed by a brother, armed by a cyclops, and forged across a decade of war. That god lowered himself into the deep water and felt, finally, the particular peace of arriving somewhere that belongs entirely to you. But peace, for Poseidon, was never a permanent condition. The sea is patient, yes, vast and quiet and capable of extraordinary stillness, but it is also restless. It is always, beneath its surface, moving. It is always building towards something. And Poseidon, in the long, ambitious, turbulent centuries that lay ahead of him, would do the same. There is a particular quality to the light beneath the ocean's surface. If you have ever swum in clear water on a bright day and looked upward, look back toward the sky from below, you will know what it is. The light breaks apart. It fractures into long, shifting columns that bend and sway as the water moves, like the fingers of something enormous slowly opening and closing above you. It is beautiful, in a way that is difficult to articulate, because it is also slightly unnerving. You are in another world. The rules are different here. Sound travels differently. Weight means something different. The horizon, which on land is a fixed and dependable thing, no longer exists. The ancient Greeks understood this instinctively. The ocean was not simply a large body of water to them. It was a separate dimension, a parallel world with its own geography, its own population, its own hierarchy, and presiding over all of it, seated on a throne of coral and burnished gold at the very bottom of the deepest sea, was Poseidon. Let us go there now. Let us descend, slowly and carefully, into the world he built and the world he ruled. Because to truly understand Poseidon, not as a symbol, not as a name on a museum placard, but as the living, breathing presence the ancient world genuinely believed in, you must first understand the astonishing breadth of what surrounded him, what answered to him, what feared him, and what loved him, and what swam beside his golden chariot as he moved across the face of the water like a storm in the shape of a king. His palace was called, in some ancient traditions, simply the Deep House. Scholars and poets have described it differently across the centuries, but the consistent image is one of breathtaking, submarine magnificence. Walls of pale stone and dark coral, floors that shimmered with abalone and crushed pearl, great columns draped in living sea plants that moved in the current like curtains in a gentle breeze. The light that filtered through the water above gave everything a shifting liquid quality. Nothing was ever entirely still, nothing was ever entirely solid. It was a palace that breathed. Homer, in the Iliad, describes Poseidon leaving this palace to join the war at Troy, harnessing his divine horses, donning his golden armor, driving his chariot across the surface of the sea with such speed and joy that the creatures of the ocean rose around him in recognition. Sea creatures great and small acknowledged their lord. They did not hide when he passed. They gathered. This is the image worth holding. Not Poseidon raging, not Poseidon in the violence of a storm, but Poseidon moving across his domain in the fullness of his power, and every living thing in the water knowing him. That recognition, that relationship between a god and his kingdom, was central to how the Greeks understood divine authority. A god's power was not simply a matter of brute force. It was a matter of belonging. Poseidon did not merely control the sea, he was, in some essential and unquantifiable way, continuous with it. When the sea was calm, he was at rest. When it raged, he was angry. When it moved in those slow, rolling swells that sailors learned to read the way scholars read text, patient, unhurried, carrying immense weight over immense distances, that was Poseidon thinking. And the creatures of his kingdom were not merely inhabitants, they were expressions of him, extensions of his will, his mood, his mythological personality. The hippocampi came first in any accounting of Poseidon's court, because they were the closest to him, literally, and because they represented the union of his two greatest domains, our horse, our fish. The forelegs and proud neck and flowing mane of a stallion merging seamlessly at the midpoint of the body into the scaled, powerful tail of a great fish. Ancient Greek art is full of them, painted on pottery, carved into temple friezes, depicted on the mosaic floors of bathhouses from Greece to Rome. They pulled Poseidon's chariot across the water, and in artistic representations, they are almost always shown at speed, necks arched, manes streaming, their fishtails churning white foam behind them. They were not monstrous. This is important. The hippocampi were beautiful, deliberately, purposefully beautiful, in a way that communicated something specific about their master. Poseidon was fearsome, yes, unpredictable, certainly, but he was also magnificent. His kingdom was not a dark and terrible place. It was a place of extraordinary, alien beauty, and the creatures nearest to him reflected that. The dolphins were his heralds, and there is something genuinely touching about the role they play in his mythology. The ancient Greeks adored dolphins, not simply as marine animals, but as intelligent, semi-divine beings who existed at the boundary between the human world and Poseidon's. Sailors who saw dolphins alongside their ships understood it as a blessing, an acknowledgement from the god that the voyage was known to him and that today, at least, he was in good temper. In one of the most charming myths surrounding Poseidon, dolphins served as his matchmakers, tracking down the sea nymph Amphitrite when she fled his advances, and speaking on his behalf with such gentleness and eloquence that she was persuaded to return and become his queen. In gratitude, Poseidon placed the dolphin among the stars. The constellation Delphinus, small and elegant in the night sky, has carried that story for over 2,000 years. Then there were the great sea creatures, the ones that lived in the deeper, darker registers of Poseidon's kingdom, and represented not his beauty, but his terror. The Ketia were enormous sea monsters, ancient even by the standards of mythology, These were the leviathans of the Greek world, vast, serpentine beings of immeasurable size that moved through the deepest trenches at Poseidon's command and surfaced, when commanded, to punish coastal peoples who had offended the god. The most famous of them was sent against the kingdom of Ethiopia, where Queen Cassiopeia had made the catastrophic error of boasting that her daughter Andromeda was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs who were among Poseidon's most beloved subjects. The Ketos surfaced. It approached the coastline. An entire kingdom fell to its knees, and Andromeda, chained to a rock above the waterline as a sacrifice, waited for a death that came from the sea with Poseidon's full authority behind it. Perseus arrived first, as the story goes, but the monster had been sent, and for a time it had been obeyed. The Nereids themselves deserve a careful moment of attention because they are one of the most significant populations of Poseidon's kingdom and one of the most misunderstood. They were not simply decorative figures. They were not mermaids in the modern, simplified sense. The Nereids were 50 daughters of the ancient sea god Nereus, gentle, prophetic, deeply wise beings who knew the sea's moods the way a physician knows a patient. They helped sailors navigate difficult passages. They guided ships around dangerous rocks. Thetis, perhaps the most famous of all Nereids, was so significant that the gods themselves sought her as a bride, until a prophecy warned that her son would surpass his father, at which point she was married instead to the mortal king Peleus, and gave birth to Achilles. The Nereids moved through Poseidon's kingdom with grace and knowledge and a kind of benevolent authority that complemented their ruler's more volatile energy. If Poseidon was the storm, they were the deep water beneath it, always present, always moving, and in their way, more constant and more powerful than the turbulence above. His queen was Amphitrite, the Nereid he had pursued and eventually won, the sea goddess who became his consort and shared his throne. She is a quieter figure in the mythology than her husband, but not an absent one. She was depicted wearing a net as a crown, with lobsters in her hair, an image that sounds strange to modern ears but was, to the ancients, an image of absolute marine authority. She bore Poseidon 3 children of note. Triton, the most famous, was a merman, human from the waist up, fish from the waist down, who served as his father's herald and messenger, blowing on a great conch shell whose sound could calm the seas or raise them into fury depending on the god's mood. Rhode, a daughter associated with the island of Rhodes, and Benthesicaime, whose very name means deep wave, a goddess so oceanic that she was, in some sense, the water itself given personhood and will. Beyond his legitimate family, Poseidon fathered an enormous number of children by other beings, both divine and mortal. And unlike the children of Zeus, who tended toward heroes of extraordinary virtue, Poseidon's offspring carried a particular stamp. They were powerful, they were enormous, and they were very often difficult. Polyphemus the Cyclops was his son, the great one-eyed shepherd of Sicily whom Odysseus blinded, and whose blinding drew down upon that unfortunate hero 10 years of Poseidon's unrelenting, ocean-wide vengeance. His other children included Orion, the great hunter, who was said to be so enormous he could walk across the sea floor with his head above the waves, Antaeus, the Libyan giant who drew his strength from contact with the earth, and whom Heracles defeated only by holding him in the air, and Chrysaor and Pegasus, who both sprang from the blood of Medusa when Perseus cut her head, a lineage that connects Poseidon to one of the most enduring images in all of classical mythology, the white-winged horse rising from violence and blood, carrying divinity upward on feathered wings. Even in that high and luminous image, there was Poseidon at the root of it. And then there was the trident, 3 prongs, each one representing, in most scholarly interpretations, one of the 3 great expressions of his power: the sea, the earthquake, the horse. Three domains, three kinds of dominion, held together in a single shaft of divine metal that the god carried wherever he went. It was never set down. It was never handed to another. It was as much a part of him as his hands. The trident was also, crucially, a creative instrument, not simply a weapon of destruction. When Poseidon struck rock with it, springs of water rose from the earth. When he drove it into the seafloor, new islands surfaced from the deep. The world was literally larger, in the Greek imagination, because Poseidon had struck it in the right places. The geography of Greece itself, those hundreds of islands, those deep harbors, those jagged coastlines where land and sea argue endlessly with each other about where one ends and the other begins. All of that was the legacy of a god who had spent eternity reshaping the world with 3 points of divine iron. He did not merely rule the sea. He had built it. He had hammered it into shape. He had populated it, and lit it with strange light, and filled it with creatures both beautiful and terrifying, and placed at its center a throne from which he could observe all of it simultaneously. The surface and the depth, the harbor and the open ocean, the calm morning water and the 30-foot wall of a storm swell, all of it, all at once, all his. That is what it means to sit at the bottom of the sea and hold a trident. That is what it means to be Poseidon. Anger, in the ancient Greek understanding of divinity, was not a flaw. This is worth establishing clearly, because it runs counter to everything the modern world tends to assume about what a god should be. We have inherited, through centuries of theological evolution, an idea of the divine as patient, forgiving, slow to wrath, and quick to mercy. A god who loses his temper, in our current moral vocabulary, seems diminished, too human, too reactive, too small for the throne we have assigned him. For them, divine anger was not a contradiction of power, it was the expression of it. A god who did not rage when wronged was a god who did not care. And a god who did not care was a god without investment in the world, which was the most dangerous kind of all. The anger of the gods was proof that the world mattered to them, that it was worth fighting over, worth destroying cities for, worth holding a grudge about for a decade or a century, or, in some cases, for as long as the ocean itself had existed. No god in the Greek pantheon embodied this truth more completely than Poseidon. He was not angry because he was unstable. He was angry because he was powerful, and because the world kept doing things that a powerful being found intolerable. The sea does not apologize for a storm. The earthquake does not explain itself. And Poseidon, god of both, simply was what the elements he commanded were. Enormous, ungovernable, and absolutely certain that he was right. Let us look at what made him so certain. Let us look at the great rivalries and the great furious episodes of his divine life, because in them we find not simply a catalogue of mythological conflict, but something that reads, if you allow it to, as a remarkably coherent portrait of a personality. Poseidon was not random in his anger. There was always a reason. And the reason, almost always, came down to one thing. He had been denied something that was rightfully his. The contest for Athens is perhaps the most famous episode in all of Poseidon's mythology. And it is worth taking time with, because on the surface it sounds like a simple competition with a clear winner and a clear loser. But beneath that surface, as with most things in the Greek mythological tradition, there is something far more interesting going on. Athens, in the great age before it became Athens, was simply a city on a rock. The Acropolis, a high, flat-topped limestone plateau rising above the Attic plain, commanding views in every direction, defensible, strategic, beautiful. And two gods wanted it. Poseidon arrived first, by most accounts. He stood on that high rock, and he looked out over what would become one of the most celebrated cities in human history. And he wanted it with the particular intensity that Poseidon brought to everything he desired. He raised his trident. He struck the rock of the Acropolis, and from the stone, salt water erupted. A spring, or in some versions, a small inland sea, bursting upward from a point of bare limestone hundreds of feet above the actual coastline. A miracle. Proof of divine presence. The rock itself had answered him. Then Athena arrived. She knelt, or stood, depending on the telling, and she planted something in the earth. An olive tree, small, silver-leafed, already heavy with fruit, quiet in the way that all genuinely profound things are quiet when placed beside impressive noise. The gods of Olympus were called to judge. Zeus presided. The decision, depending on which version you read, was made by a vote among the gods, or by Zeus alone, or by the women of the city who outnumbered the men and voted for Athena's gift because they understood, with practical feminine intelligence, that olives meant oil, and oil meant food, light, medicine, trade, and survival in a way that a saltwater spring simply did not. Athena won. The city took her name. Her olive tree was tended for centuries on the Acropolis, and even when the Persians burned it to the root during their sack of Athens, it was said to have sprouted new growth within days, as if the goddess herself refused to concede the point. That tree was her claim, permanent and living and renewable. It outlasted armies, and Poseidon did not accept the verdict quietly. His response to losing was immediate and physical. He flooded the Thriasian plain, the flat agricultural land to the west of Athens, in an act of pure, undisguised fury. The water came without warning, without reason, beyond the gods' wounded pride, and it destroyed whatever stood in its path. He did not petition for a recount. He did not argue his case again before the divine court. He simply raised the sea and let it go. This is Poseidon, not in his magnificent moments on his golden chariot, not in the majestic image of a god at ease in his underwater palace. This is Poseidon in defeat, and he was, in defeat, every bit as powerful as he was in triumph. Perhaps more so, because at least in triumph there was satisfaction to soften the edge of it. In defeat, there was only the water, and the water went where it was told. The Athenians, to their considerable credit, and with the particular pragmatism that would come to define their civilization, did not simply write Poseidon off after this. They were not foolish enough to make an enemy of the sea god simply because he had lost a political contest. They built him temples. They held festivals in his honor. They gave him his due. The city of Athens, Athena's city, never forgot that Poseidon had struck the rock, and that his mark, that saltwater spring, that crack in the limestone, remained there as long as the Acropolis stood. They understood that you do not win a contest against a god and then simply stop paying attention to him. But it was not cities that drew the sharpest edges of Poseidon's wrath. It was heroes. Heroes were, almost by definition, people who exceeded what was normal. They went to places others would not go. They killed things others could not kill. They refused to die when any reasonable person would have died. And they kept insisting on their own significance in a universe that was largely organized around the significance of gods. This made them, almost inevitably, irritants to the divine beings who crossed their paths. And Poseidon crossed the paths of several. Laomedon, king of Troy, possessed a particular talent for dishonoring his agreements that managed to insult Poseidon and Apollo simultaneously, which is the kind of achievement that requires either remarkable arrogance or a complete failure to understand the world one lives in. The gods had been sentenced, in some accounts as punishment for a rebellion against Zeus, in others simply as a condition placed upon them, to serve the mortal king of Troy for a year. Poseidon built the great walls of Troy. That is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. The god of earthquakes and foundations laid the stones that made Troy the most formidable city in the ancient world. Walls so strong that it would take 10 years of war and the specific subterfuge of a hollow horse to breach them. He built those walls with his divine hands, at the command of a mortal, in exchange for a promised payment. Laomedon refused to pay. Apollo's response when it came was disease, a plague that swept through the region with devastating efficiency. Poseidon's response was a sea monster. He sent Akitos to ravage the Trojan coastline. Ships could not sail. Fishermen could not work. The creature moved through the water with slow, terrible purpose, and Troy, for all the magnificence of its walls, found itself besieged not by armies, but by the sea itself. The oracle's answer was sacrifice. Specifically, the sacrifice of Laomedon's own daughter Hesione, chained to the rocks at the water's edge, waiting for the monster to collect what the king's dishonesty had purchased. Heracles arrived and killed the creature, in exchange for a payment of divine horses. Laomedon refused to pay Heracles as well. Heracles returned later with an army and sacked the city entirely. The point, for our purposes, is this. Poseidon had built the greatest walls in the ancient world, and when he was cheated, he sent the sea against the people those walls were built to protect. The God who creates is the same God who destroys. The power is not divided into separate, compartmentalized functions. It is one power, and it flows in whatever direction the god requires. And then there is Odysseus. There is always, in any honest accounting of Poseidon's wrath, Odysseus. The story is well known in its broad strokes. The hero of Ithaca, the cleverest man alive, the one who devised the wooden horse and ended the 10-year war at Troy, then spent another 10 years trying to sail home across a sea that refused to let him. But the texture of what Poseidon did to Odysseus, the sustained, patient, inventive ferocity of it, is worth examining closely because it reveals something essential about how the god of the sea understood vengeance. It was not simple. It was not a matter of drowning the man and being done with it. That would have been efficient. Poseidon was not in an efficient mood. He had been absent when Odysseus blinded Polyphemus, attending a festival among the Ethiopians at the far edge of the world. When he returned and learned what had happened to his son, his response was not immediate. He did not rush. He gathered himself, and then, with the methodical deliberateness of an ocean current that cannot be fought or argued with, only endured, he went to work. He sank ships. He raised storms from clear skies. He sent Odysseus to islands that were not on any map and kept him there for years at a time. 7 years with the nymph Calypso alone, trapped on a beautiful island in the middle of the sea, not suffering exactly, but stranded, held, prevented from the one thing he most wanted. He worked through proxies and through weather and through the simple, overwhelming fact that when you are trying to cross the sea and the god of the sea is against you, the sea is against you. Every wave, every wind, every current that should have carried you east carrying you west instead. What makes this particularly remarkable is that Poseidon was operating in defiance of the other gods for much of this time. Athena favored Odysseus. Zeus generally agreed that the man had suffered enough. The rest of the gods were prepared to let it end, and still Poseidon kept at it. One god, against the general consensus of Olympus, sustained a 10-year campaign of nautical persecution against a single mortal because that mortal had hurt his son. This tells us something, not about cruelty, though cruelty is certainly present in the myth, but about love. Poseidon was not simply powerful. He was attached. He cared, ferociously, disproportionately, in the way that only those who feel things deeply are capable of caring. His children mattered to him. His dignity mattered to him. Odysseus reached Ithaca. After 20 years away, he came home. Poseidon did not prevent it in the end, because Zeus himself made clear that enough was enough, and even the god of the sea operated within the structure of an ordered universe. But he had his last word even then. The Phaeacians, the seafaring people who had finally carried Odysseus home on one of their magical ships, were punished for the act. Poseidon turned their ship to stone as it sailed back across the open water, a visible monument to his displeasure, a warning to anyone watching from the shore. I know what you did. I know who helped him. And I do not forget. The stone ship sat at the entrance to the Phaeacian harbor for as long as the myth was told. A reminder, a monument, a god's final quiet word on the subject of what it costs to carry his enemies home. And yet, and this must be said, because the truth of Poseidon is not complete without it. For all the storms, for all the vendettas and the flooded plains and the sea monsters sent to consume the daughters of careless kings, the ancient world continued to love him. Sailors prayed to him before every voyage. Fishermen left offerings at his shoreline temples before every season. Cities built him the most dramatic, most wind-battered, most breathtaking temples they could find locations for, always at the edge of land, always facing the water, always positioned so that the god of the sea could look out from the columns of his house and see what was his. They were afraid of him, yes. The sea is always frightening to those who depend on it, but they were also grateful. And in the complicated, honest theology of the ancient Greek world, gratitude and fear were not opposites. They were simply the two faces of the same enormous salt spray truth. The sea gives, the sea takes, and Poseidon, in all his fury and all his magnificence, was exactly as generous as the ocean he commanded, which is to say, more generous than anyone frightened by his storms ever quite expected. We have spent considerable time in the storm, and rightly so, because the storm is real and the wrath is real, and any honest portrait of Poseidon that softens those edges into something comfortable would be doing him a disservice. The sea is not comfortable. It was not meant to be, and the god who embodies it should not be made smaller than what he rules simply because smallness is easier to sit with. But there is something else, something the storms and the vendettas and the flooded plains can obscure if you are not paying careful attention. Something that surfaces quietly and consistently in the margins of the mythology, in the smaller myths, the lesser told stories, the ones that don't make it into the dramatized retellings because they lack the clean narrative arc of a hero in peril or a city under siege. Tenderness. Not soft tenderness, not the gentle, uncomplicated tenderness of a being who has never known loss or rage, but the tenderness of something enormous that has chosen, in a given moment, to be careful. The way the ocean can be, on a windless morning in late summer, when the water is so still and so clear and so perfectly achingly blue that you forget, temporarily and completely, that it has ever been anything else. That is the Poseidon we have not yet visited, and he is worth a visit. Begin with Amphitrite, because she is where the most important tenderness lives, and because her story is so often reduced to a footnote in the larger drama of her husband's mythology. She was a Nereid, the granddaughter of the ancient ocean god Oceanus, one of 50 daughters of the gentle sea prophet Nereus. She was, by all accounts, extraordinary. Ancient artists depicted her with a kind of quiet authority that her husband's images rarely captured, serene where he was volatile, composed where he was kinetic. She wore her crown of nets and sea creatures with the ease of someone who had never needed to prove anything to anyone. When Poseidon first saw her, she was dancing. This detail, preserved in various forms across different ancient sources, is worth pausing on. She was dancing with her sisters on the island of Naxos. that beautiful vine-covered Aegean island that appears again and again in Greek mythology as a place where something significant is always on the verge of happening. The dance was a ritual, a celebration, and Poseidon, the god of the most powerful force in the natural world, the being who had fought a 10-year cosmic war and held a trident that could crack the earth, stopped. He watched, and then he wanted. Amphitrite, for her part, did not want to be wanted, not by him, not yet. When his intentions became clear, she fled, swimming to the far edge of the world, to the court of the Titan Atlas near the mountains that bear his name, putting as much ocean between herself and the pursuing god as the ocean would allow, which, given that the ocean was his, was a considerable irony. He sent the dolphin. This is the detail that changes the entire tone of the myth, if you let it. He did not follow her himself. He did not command her return. He did not raise a storm and redirect her course. He sent an emissary, a single dolphin, gentle and intelligent and possessed of what the ancient poets credited as genuine eloquence, to speak on his behalf, to carry his words across the water to a goddess who had chosen distance over nearness, and to make his case not with power, but with persuasion. The dolphin spoke of Poseidon's genuine feeling, his longing, his intention to honor her as a queen deserved to be honored. And Amphitrite, listening at the edge of the world, in the shadow of Atlas's mountains, was moved. She returned. She married him. And Poseidon, in gratitude for the dolphin's service, in what is perhaps the most charming thing he ever did, placed that dolphin among the stars. Delphinus, a small, bright constellation in the summer sky, still visible tonight if the night is clear enough, still carrying the story of a god who, at least once, chose gentleness when force was available. Their life together was not always simple. No marriage between two beings of divine magnitude and independent will is ever simple, but it was real. Amphitrite was not a decorative queen. She was a genuine consort, present in his court, respected by his creatures, holding her own authority over the sea's gentler inhabitants. When ancient images showed Poseidon on his chariot, she was often beside him, not behind. Beside. He had chosen well, and some part of him knew it, and that knowing made him, in his better moments, in the calm morning version of himself, something approaching grateful. Then there were the islands. This is perhaps the least discussed aspect of Poseidon's creative life, and it is the one that most directly contradicts the image of a god defined primarily by destruction. Poseidon did not only tear the earth apart, he also made it. He raised land from the sea with his trident, the same way he sank it, deliberately, purposefully, as an act of will directed at a world he was continuously shaping. The island of Delos is one such creation in mythological tradition. Rhodes was said to have risen from the sea as a gift, an island of sunlight and roses that became sacred to Helios, the sun god, but which the sea had first offered up from its depths. The volcanic islands of the Aegean, in the ancient Greek imagination, were not geological events. They were decisions. The earth moved because Poseidon moved it. The sea parted because he permitted the parting. Every island that rose from the water was, in some fundamental sense, an act of Poseidon's generosity, a gift of solid ground to creatures who could not live without it, offered by a god who lived entirely without it himself. There is something quietly poignant about this, if you consider it long enough. Poseidon, who breathed water and walked the seafloor and had no particular need of dry land, spent a significant portion of his divine energy creating it for others, building coastlines, raising harbors, striking rock to produce freshwater springs in places where the land was otherwise inhospitable. He made the world more livable, not for his own comfort, but because making was what the trident was for. Not only breaking, not only punishing, but building, raising, creating from nothing, the solid ground on which entire civilizations would eventually stand. His love for his children, the ones he cherished, the ones who did not become monsters or giants or instruments of someone else's vengeance, runs through the mythology in a quieter register, but it is there. Triton, his son with Amphitrite, was given genuine responsibility. He was not simply a herald. He was an extension of his father's will and his father's voice. The conch shell he carried was the sea's own instrument, and when Triton blew it, the water responded in ways that reflected his father's intentions rather than his own. He was trusted with the ocean's mood in a way that only a beloved child is trusted with something precious. There is also the myth of Pelops, which is rarely connected to Poseidon in popular retellings, but belongs to him unmistakably. Pelops was a young man of extraordinary beauty and difficult circumstances. His father, Tantalus, had committed an atrocity against the gods that resulted in Pelops being killed and served at a divine feast. The gods refused the meal with horror and restored the boy to life. And it was Poseidon who, when Pelops was restored, chose him, loved him, carried him to Olympus for a time, and gave him divine gifts, including when Pelops needed to win a chariot race to claim the woman he loved, and the kingdom she would bring with her, a set of divine golden horses, and a chariot of effortless speed. He gave them freely, without condition, without the complicated contractual arrangements that so often govern divine gifts in the Greek world. He gave them because he loved the young man and wanted him to win. Pelops won. He married Hippodamia. He founded a dynasty that would eventually produce Agamemnon and Menelaus, and begin, in its own roundabout way, the chain of events that led to the Trojan War. And at the beginning of all of that long, bloody, magnificent history, there was Poseidon, quietly handing a young man a set of horses and saying, in essence, go, win, I am with you. The ocean at its calmest is not passive. This is a truth that anyone who has spent real time near the water understands instinctively. The stillness of a flat sea on a clear morning is not the stillness of something absent or dormant. It is the stillness of something vast, paying attention. Something that has decided, for now, to simply be present, to reflect the sky above it perfectly, to carry the light, to move in those long, slow, barely visible swells that roll in from distances so great they have no local weather attached to them. They are the memory of storms that happened somewhere else weeks ago, traveling still. That is the Poseidon of this segment, the one who sent the dolphin instead of the storm, the one who raised islands from nothing and gave them to the world, the one who placed a constellation in the sky in gratitude for an act of gentle persuasion, the one who loved his queen and trusted his son and gave his horses freely to a young man who needed them. He was not only fury, he was also this vast, attentive, creative, occasionally devastating tenderness that the sea has always carried alongside its violence. Both things were real. Both things were him. And the ancient world, which understood the ocean far more intimately than most of us do today, never made the mistake of separating them. The sea does not choose between beauty and danger. It simply is both, completely and simultaneously at all times. And so was he. Nothing that has ever touched the ocean truly leaves it. This is not poetry. It is, in its way, physical fact. The water cycle ensures it. Every drop of rain that falls on the mountains eventually finds its way back to the sea, carrying with it the minerals it dissolved, the soil it moved, the small histories of every landscape it passed through. The ocean receives all of it. It holds all of it. It incorporates everything that has ever been given to it into itself, and continues, unchanged in its essential nature, moving. Poseidon is like this. He has been receiving and incorporating and continuing for over 3,000 years, since the last Greek temple fire burned in his name. He was absorbed into Rome and given a new name. He was rediscovered by the Renaissance and given a new face. He was borrowed by navigators and astronomers and poets and painters and the people who named the eighth planet from the sun. He was carried in the holds of sailing ships to every coastline in the world, and on each one he left something: a story, a superstition, a word, an image carved in stone or pressed in bronze or painted on the curved interior of a cathedral ceiling, where a bishop who would never have admitted it looked up at a trident and felt, obscurely, the presence of something ancient. He never left. He simply changed shape, and the ocean, which he commanded, carried him everywhere. When Rome absorbed the Greek world, slowly, unevenly, with the particular thoroughness of a civilization that conquered with armies and then surrendered to culture, it took the Greek gods with it and gave them Latin names. Zeus became Jupiter, Hades became Pluto, Ares became Mars, and Poseidon became Neptune. The transition was not simply a renaming, it was a reinterpretation. Neptune was, in the earliest Roman religious tradition, actually a god of fresh water, rivers, lakes, the interior springs that the agricultural Roman world depended on for survival. He was a different god, with different concerns and a different temperament. When the Romans encountered the Greek Poseidon and decided that their Neptune was essentially the same figure, they were making a theological decision that said something important about what they believed divinity to be, not a specific, fixed personality, but an archetype, a function, the divine force that governs water in all its forms, by whatever name a civilization chooses to call it. Neptune absorbed Poseidon's mythology almost entirely: the trident, the horse, the underwater palace, the storms and the earthquakes. All of it crossed the Adriatic and settled into Roman religious practice with remarkable smoothness, as if the myths themselves knew they belonged wherever the ocean reached. And since Rome's empire eventually extended to every coastline of the Mediterranean, to the Atlantic shores of modern France and Spain and Britain, to the North African coast, to the Levant, Neptune went with it. Everywhere Rome built a harbor, Neptune had a temple. Everywhere a Roman general crossed the sea, he made offerings first. The Feast of the Neptunalia was celebrated on July 23rd each year, in the hottest, driest part of the Roman summer, when the rivers were low and the springs threatened to fail, when water was most precious and most needed. Romans built shelters of branches near streams and rivers, and spent the day in the shade, asking Neptune for the rains that would come in autumn, for the underground springs to hold, for the rivers to remember their purpose. It was a festival of anticipation and gratitude, both the particular Roman understanding that the divine must be continuously acknowledged, not only in crisis, but in the calm before it. This is Poseidon at his most Mediterranean, not the stormbringer, not the earth shaker. Simply the god of water, patient under a hot blue sky, waiting to be asked for rain. Rome fell, or rather, Rome transformed, into the Byzantine East, into the fragmented kingdoms of medieval Europe, into a continent that replaced its old gods with a new theology that had no place for tridents or underwater palaces. The temples were closed, the festivals were forbidden, the sacred fires at the coastal sanctuaries were extinguished, and the priests who attended them either converted or disappeared into the historical record's vast silence. But the ocean remained, and the sea, which does not care about the theological preferences of any particular century, continued to be terrifying and magnificent and utterly beyond human control. Medieval sailors, officially Christian, prayed to saints for protection at sea: St. Nicholas, St. Elmo, St. Brendan. But the old instincts persisted underneath the new vocabulary. The sea still had a personality. It still had moods. It still seemed, on certain nights when the water turned black and the horizon disappeared, and the wind came from no direction that made navigational sense, to be actively hostile in the way that only a conscious being can be hostile. Medieval sailors did not call him Poseidon, but they knew something was down there, and they were careful about it, and they threw things overboard sometimes when the storm was very bad. Offerings, essentially, dressed in the language of misfortune and accident. The name was gone. The instinct endured. The Renaissance brought him back with extraordinary force. When the scholars and artists of 15th and 16th century Italy rediscovered the classical world, not merely as historical curiosity, but as living aesthetic and philosophical inspiration, Poseidon, wearing Neptune's Roman name, came flooding back into European visual culture with an energy that suggested he had merely been waiting. Donatello sculpted him. Bernini gave him one of the most dramatic fountain appearances in the history of public art. The Fontana del Nettuno in Bologna, where Neptune stands at the center of an elaborate bronze composition, trident raised, surrounded by figures that represent the rivers of the world, water pouring from every surface in a controlled and magnificent cascade that has been running continuously since 1566. Fountains became his primary domain in the urban landscape of Renaissance and Baroque Europe. City after city commissioned Neptune at their centers. Bologna, Florence, Rome, Berlin, Warsaw, Nuremberg, Trevi. The logic was partly aesthetic and partly ancient. A city that commanded water was a city that commanded power, and placing Neptune at the center of that water was a way of invoking the prestige of antiquity, the mastery of nature, the civilizational confidence of a society that could make water do what it wanted. He stood in the middle of landlocked cities, hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline, trident raised over a fountain basin. And something of the original intention remained. The water still gathered around him as if it recognized him. People still brought coins. They still made wishes. The ritual had changed its name and lost its theology. But the instinct to bring something small and valuable to the edge of the water and ask for something in return, that instinct was 3,000 years old and showed no sign of concluding. Then humanity looked upward and found him there as well. The eighth planet from the Sun was discovered in 1846 by the German astronomer Johann Galle, working from mathematical predictions made by the French mathematician Urbain Le Verrier. It was the first planet found through calculation rather than observation, predicted into existence on paper before anyone saw it in the sky, which is remarkable enough on its own. When it came time to name it, the astronomers looked at this enormous, distant, blue-green planet, the most ocean-colored object in the visible solar system, and there was really only one name that made sense: Neptune. Poseidon, in Roman dress, given dominion over a planet 14 times the size of Earth, orbiting the Sun at such a distance that its year lasts the equivalent of 165 of ours. It storms. And it has storms. The fastest winds in the solar system. Hurricane systems larger than the entire Earth move at speeds that dwarf anything the Aegean ever produced. Its largest moon is called Triton, the sun who blew the conch shell. It has been visited once by Voyager 2 in 1989, which flew past it in a matter of hours after a 12-year journey, sending back images of a world so blue and so strange that astronomers fell briefly silent looking at them. Poseidon had always encircled the world. Now he encircled the solar system. The ocean's edge, it turned out, was much further away than even the most ambitious Greek sailor had imagined. And so we arrive, at last, at the present, at the coastlines that exist today. All of them, everywhere on Earth. Stand on any one of them. Stand at the edge of the water at any point on the planet's perimeter. The rocky coasts of Scotland, the black sand beaches of Iceland, the warm, flat shores of the Gulf of Mexico, the cliff faces of New Zealand dropping straight into the Tasman Sea, and you will feel something. It is not imaginary. It is not the projection of a mind that has spent too long with ancient mythology. It is something real, something physical, something that human beings have been feeling at the edge of water for as long as there have been human beings with the capacity for feeling. The ocean is alive. Not metaphorically, not poetically, in the way that something vast and moving and possessed of genuine force and genuine variability feels alive to the nervous system of any creature standing at its edge. It breathes. It has moods. It pushes toward you and pulls away in a rhythm that, if you stand there long enough, begins to feel less like physics and more like intention. The Greeks named that intention Poseidon. They gave it a face and a trident and a palace and a history and a family and a temper and a capacity for gentleness. They did this not because they were primitive or deluded, but because they were paying attention, because they understood, with the particular intelligence of people who lived close to the natural world, that naming something is the beginning of understanding it. That personhood is the framework through which human minds most naturally process what they cannot control. We no longer build temples on the capes. We no longer cast offerings from the sterns of ships before sailing. We explain the ocean now in the language of fluid dynamics and seismic activity, and atmospheric pressure systems, and tidal forces governed by the pull of the moon. And these explanations are correct. They are useful. They have made navigation safer and coastal living more predictable, and the sea, in many ways, less immediately lethal than it once was. But the ocean remains what it has always been, and on the mornings when the water is absolutely still, and the light is breaking into those long shifting columns beneath the surface. On the evenings when a storm comes in from the open sea with a speed and a violence that the forecast did not quite anticipate. On the quiet winter afternoons when the waves roll in from unimaginable distances in slow, heavy swells that carry no local weather, only the memory of something that happened somewhere far away and long ago. On those mornings and those evenings and those winter afternoons, something persists, something older than any name we have given it, something that the ancient world simply chose to address directly with offerings and temples, and the honest acknowledgement of human smallness in the face of forces that do not require our permission to exist. Poseidon is not gone. He was never the kind of thing that could be gone. He is the deep water. He is the ground moving beneath your feet without warning. He is the horse at full gallop, mane in the wind, answerable to nothing. He is the still morning and the 30-foot wave. He is the dolphin turning in the surf at sunset, and the dark shape moving slowly, far below, in water where the light no longer reaches. He is the ocean, and the ocean is still here. It has always been here. It will outlast every name we give it, and receive every name gratefully, and continue, as it has always continued, moving.